today, because I think it's worthwhile just queuing us up for the reading we're about to hear. Title of our, that, by the way, that's just a quick word for the parents. This morning, a toddler after eating 1 square of chocolate. I'm not quite sure why I put that on there. Just thought it was great. Last week we was talking about the Pharisees, and we're continuing on a little bit with the Pharisees, but transitioning that into how we respond to the Pharisees of our own day, or the ideas of Pharisees of our own day. And that's C.S. Lewis's words. And we looked at how when religious behavior goes wrong and what that looks like. Today our title is Effluence and Influence, Navigating the Perilous Culture Wars of Our Time. When we think about effluence, in an older meaning, the word was a stream flowing out of a river or lake. There was no comment on whether the water was dirty or clean. But nowadays, effluence almost always means wastes that pour into our water and air. Liquid factory waste, smoke, raw sewage can all be called effluence. As adults, we're thinking about, in our reading, yeast in a negative way, a kind of effluent, as it were. There's a positive way that we talked about, because Jesus has both sides in how he refers to yeast, and there's the negative way in which we're going to hear the reading in a moment. But this passage that we're going to hear frames the bad thing that quietly spreads in a toxic, effluent kind of way. Nutritional yeast, that's the good thing. Yeast infection, that's pretty unpleasant. I won't leave that up very long, don't worry. All right. So, yeast is, if you like, in this context we're about to hear, the not clean water from the lake. It's toxic with chemicals and filth and microplastics. It's an infection that spreads. And Jesus says, beware the spread of Pharisaic yeast. So let's hear our reading now as Rachel reads that to us.
Okay, so the reading is from Luke 12, verses 1 to 3, and it's actually called in the NIV, Warnings and Encouragements. Meanwhile, when a crowd of many thousands had gathered, so that they were trampling on one another, Jesus began to speak first to his disciples, saying, "Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. There is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known. What you have said in the dark will be heard in the daylight, and what you have whispered in the ear in the inner rooms will be proclaimed from the roofs."
Thank you. So I've written a little ditty for this. We can just have the slide up, thanks. So a song for the Pharisees to the tune, hope I don't ruin this for people, to the tune of meekness and majesty. Effluence and influence, stinky with sophistry, filled with pomposity, the ones who are lost, caught in a tangled web. Christ says they made their bed, decried everything he said, and great was the cost. Altogether, yeast of the Pharisees, stinky pomposity, failed in their calling to walk before God. Don't worry, there's no more verses. Okay, effluence and influence is what we're talking about. By the way, I think I get credit for being able to include the word sophistry in a song, right? Okay. Sophistry is a subtly deceptive reasoning or argument, just in case you're wondering. Okay, so the focus shifts in this passage from having a dip at the religious and theological leaders in the community, the scribes and the Pharisees, the guys who kind of run things around here. And Jesus has pointed earlier in Luke 11, to their terrible influence and their inner attitudes. And now he shifts focus to his disciples and says, well, how are you going to respond to these religious bullies, these powerful people? How are you going to respond as disciples? And perhaps more deeply, how will you avoid the influence of their effluence? The mission is going to go outwards. The mission of Jesus, that is, going to go outwards. It's already occurred in earlier chapters. The 12 have gone out and the 72 have gone out, and they've pioneered, they've extended Jesus' ministry. That's going to continue on right into the book of Acts. And Jesus anticipates more happening, but he also anticipates opposition and conflict in that situation. And in this situation, the conflict with the religious leaders hasn't decreased the crowds. That seems very familiar, doesn't it? It's almost like people enjoy controversy and conflict and a good show. Sounds like not much has changed in humanity. Everyone's got their popcorn there. They're all crowding in. What is it now? Is it going to be a miracle? An argument with the pompous leaders. And it says in the passage, and it's absolutely leapt out to me when I first read this passage this week, was the crowds are trampling one another. The word is katapatein. They're all trampling over one another to get a look. We get the English word peripatetic from that, but it's a bit of a shift in language. But in this context, in Luke's gospel, there's only one other time he uses this word. And Luke, when he uses words rarely, it's of significance. He's not stupid in how he phrases his descriptors. He's a careful editor of the stories of Jesus and the history of Jesus. The other time he talks about it is in the parable of the sower, where the sower sows seed along the path and tramples the seed down. And it's exactly the same word there. There are many in the crowd that are actually tone deaf. They hear the teaching, but they have big tackety boots, trampling the seed, drowning out the wisdom of God with their own noise. They perhaps haven't realized this is not about the show or the miracles or the good teaching or watching Jesus cage wrestle with the Pharisees. Maybe there's also here an echo of just what's occurred in Luke 11, verse 44, where Jesus describes the Pharisees as like hidden graves in a field, people walking over them without knowing the corruption they're stepping on, because graves being near a dead body would be ritually impure. So there's something of an infection kind of language going on here, of a damaging language, where we trample on things and we don't understand what's going on, like trampling on a meadow of native flowers, unaware. And the religious leaders have an impact on the ability of the people to hear, but the people also just mindless and unaware of what they're doing. They're casual, they're careless, and they're just there for the free snags. But among this huge crowd, if we look at the passage in verse 1, are the disciples. And Jesus takes them aside, as it were, and says, here's the disciple group. Now, we don't know precisely what number of disciples he's talking to at this point. Is it the 12 plus the women, or is it the wider group of the 72 that he's already sent out earlier? I suspect it's a wider group. And amongst all the noise of the crowd, the world around, the toxicity of the Pharisees, the hateful priests, the chitter and the chatter, the fanboys, the clamor for miracles and signs, Jesus speaks to those who are really listening. Amongst all the noise of our screens, all the voices in our heads from our past, the inner voice of the self-beat up, can we hear Jesus speaking in the midst of the clamor? Are we listening? Are we obeying? This is the parable of the sower being echoed here in real life, as it were. And in the parable of the sower, it's not just hearing, it's obeying the word of God. That's important. It's not just knowledge, but knowledge applied. Is our faith just a warm cup of cocoa, just to soothe our angst about the world? Or an afterlife insurance policy? Or is our faith a regular and ongoing silencing of the chatter around, of the noise, and with laser-like precision zeroing in on the voice of God? on the voice of Jesus, not to be entertained, not to have a message for itching ears, as Paul says, but not to be blessed, but to hear and to respond. And Jesus says this: you need to know what's happening with the Pharisees. They're going to come under judgment, but everyone is going to come under judgment. Everything will be exposed, he says in verses 1 and 2 and 3. There's judgment, I guess, is on a few levels here. Firstly, it's the judgment of the cross that's coming, and the resurrection, where they put Jesus to trial and thought that he was the one being judged, but in fact it was the religious rulers and the rulers of Israel at the time. And it was also a judgment on the principalities, the dark powers that were made a spectacle of, if we look at Colossians 2. But there's another level of judgment. There's four levels of judgment. There was the cross and Pentecost, cross and resurrection, and there's Pentecost. The Spirit comes on all flesh. It's not just priests and scribes anymore. Not just on the priestly tribe or on special festivals or people. It's on all flesh. Not just a few men, but it says on women and children too. Then there's a fourth level to the judgment, and the everything will be exposed comments of Jesus here. Is the judgment in AD 70, when the temple will be destroyed, when the Romans will come in and the Jews will have their last stand at the Masada, and they were scattered even further. And the generation who rejected Jesus are judged. And the temple system will be no more. And then finally there'll be the final judgment, when all is exposed and destroyed, when darkness is exposed, because the light will be shining. And death and darkness will be no more. But right now, in this passage, Jesus says sin is going to be exposed at some point. The light will burn it all up. So what's this yeast comment about? Well, yeast, you may know this, is a fungus, but it can either be for good or for ill, and as we've said already. Mushrooms are a fungus too, right? So the dad joke goes like this: a mushroom offers to buy everybody drinks in the bar. What do you call that mushroom? A fun guy to be with. They don't get any better than that, I'm afraid. This is why Jesus said, get rid of the yeast, right? So Passover, the day of Passover, they would get rid of the yeast. The link between yeast and the Exodus is rooted in the biblical story of the Hebrews' departure from Egypt. During the Passover, which commemorates the Exodus, God commanded the Israelites to remove all yeast, or leaven is the biblical word, from their homes and eat only unleavened bread for 7 days. The practice symbolizes a few things: the haste with which they had to leave Egypt and the sense of urgency of the time. Purity, getting rid of the yeast. Yeast became a symbol in the following years of sin. It was also a symbol of remembrance. The Feast of Unleavened Bread is a time for Jews to remember God's deliverance. And so Jesus is like a new Moses leading an Exodus movement. And the Pharisees and their barnacled teaching represent sin and yeast. The people are being infected by it. The bread blows up to a good size, but it's not great. Stick close to my teaching and lifestyle, says Jesus, because who we are infects other people. Now, I talked about this last time, but let me just say again, are you encouraging? Do you get sucked into conversations that are gossipy? Are you suspicious and wary or guarded because of your own woundedness, or people have let you down? Or do you identify with certain doctrines and you have your identity as a gatekeeper of this particular truth? And from that, like the Pharisees, you're wary of any new ways of framing things. I don't know about you, but my identity should not be a set of propositional truths or doctrines firstly. My identity is with a person who is the truth. A person is harder to nail down with a neat set of words. And when we do have to find language, we have to do so carefully, gently, and with open hands. Fundamentalism of any kind, whether to the right, the left, the liberal, the conservative, the God or the atheist, raises up to first importance things that are of secondary importance. What's first importance, in my view? The person of Jesus as the truth, the lens through which all truth claims are filtered. We seek to follow a person, firstly. His life, his lifestyle, his commitment to love and justice and so on. The creeds that have come down through the church pretty much nail the rest of it. Creator, story of Israel, virgin birth, death, resurrection, etc. But all of that in big brushstrokes. There are some things I will argue with you over, but I hope with grace and balance. We want to try and nail it all down neatly, but it's not neat sometimes. And the risk of Pharisaic blindness is huge. I think somebody has said this before. I know in part, I prophesy in part, but then we will see face to face, right? Repeat after me, I could be wrong. Turn to your neighbor and say, I could be wrong. Come on. And the liturgical response to that is you frequently are. No, don't do that. So there was vigorous debate that went on amongst the religious rulers of Jesus' day, but when they heard Jesus, he was beyond the pale. He crossed the line for them. And all I'm saying in this is be gentle in your truth claims. Genuinely engage with others. Maybe be a bit like Socrates. Ask why. That's what he brought to Greek philosophy, asking the question why. But do it with genuine curiosity. He was declared guilty of corrupting the youth of his city because his whole reason for being was to simply ask the question, why? And he kept asking why, and they declared him a corrupter of the youth, right? He encouraged open-minded questioning, and for that they made him drink hemlock. So, when your 4-year-old keeps asking why, 1, don't give them hemlock. 2, don't distract them with a shiny new thing. Oh, look over there. Just say, I'm glad to see you're learning the Socratic method. Kinders have really come on in recent years. We all have anchor points, all of us. It's not that we should be totally open-minded, our brains fall out. We follow one who is the truth. There comes a point where we have enough to go on and we say, yeah, Jesus is the key reference point for all of history. In him is light. That light is the light that lights everyone, it says in John 1. The true light. Nobody lives without some anchor points. Nobody is totally neutral or can weigh up from a lofty position of judgment. And the best evidence I have is Jesus. But I don't think Socrates is totally wrong to keep asking why. Stay open about how things work, how Jesus' teaching works, or how this part of the story happens, or how this part of whatever occurs. Have a general attitude like that. It's a why, but it's a why that's birthed out of commitment to Jesus. The Pharisees failed to recognize the Messiah when he came along, and all the other debates about theology were just toxic yeast infecting the people of God. And I think C.S. Lewis was right here. It begins here. How do you answer this question? Who do you say Jesus is? In one episode of The Simpsons, after reading the whole Bible, Homer Simpson said this: everyone in this book is a complete mess except this one guy. Listen to Homer. Think of yeast as a kind of a virus or infection that seeps into us all, trains us to a whole set of ways of thinking and living. The list would be huge, and like yeast, it's barely noticeable that it's happening. Well, it's kind of just how we think around here. It's the yeast of the internet or an entertainment culture. It's the yeast of not having to work at discipleship. After all, it's about grace, isn't it? No. It's the yeast of the body image culture, reinforced by images online of the bold and the beautiful. It's the yeast of your worth being tied to your wealth or career or other symbols of success. Remember, the Pharisees dressed to impress. Our culture has all kinds of toxic fungicidal, is that the word? Fungoid yeast? I don't know. It's the yeast of retirement. I see it in some of my school friends. retiring early. And let me say this, retiring really, really early. I'm not that old. They kick back. I've earned it. There's a truth to that. The final third of life is one long cruise, is it? In the kingdom of God, if you're following Jesus, of course you're a bit slower. Or some of us are. You've got some rewards for a life of hard work, sure. More breaks, more limitations, depending on health and strength. But I want to quote C.T. Studd at this point, the great missionary. Let us not rust out. Let us burn out for the King. Let's sprint to the finish line. And I know some of you are doing that. What other yeasts might there be that have seeped unnoticed into our journey in this culture? Freedom. Well, freedom, really? We think of freedom as opportunity to choose from a vast array of things and objects. Cereals, cars, career. Historically, freedom as a concept went from freedom from danger, fear of famine or of vicissitudes of nature, freedom from tyranny, so we developed democracy. But it morphed in the following centuries into freedom of choice. The more choice we have, the more freedom we have, therefore. But if you have a vast amount of choice, it always leaves you asking, maybe I should have chosen the other thing. I was watching a short video by a guy called Sky Jithani this week about this, and I thought I'd share a couple of quotes of his I came across. And Sky said this: if you go into a restaurant and a menu has 3 things on it to choose from, that's okay. You can just about cope with that level of choice. But suppose you go into a restaurant and it's got about 5 pages of things to choose from, and you eventually choose something. You're eating your meal, and what are you thinking of? The thing you didn't choose, right? Looking over at what your friend you're with chose. Oh, is that any good? And if it's my wife, can I have a piece of yours? Right? Or me. It leaves you second guessing. But to the poor man, the lobster or just a pizza would be a treat, and he'd be more than satisfied. Barry Schwartz, a sociologist, said this: the tyranny of choice in our culture increases anxiety and decreases satisfaction. That's precisely the direction, the trajectory of the last 30, 40 years, if you look at any of the research. When I was a kid, we had about 3 channels to watch, right? TV channels. How many channels do you have on your TV now? And still we're going, there's nothing to watch, right? Or as, forgive me, Rachel, for the accent here. Back in our day, we didn't have a TV. Our entertainment was watching a mouse come up out of a mouse hole. You had a mouse? Luxury. See, I did. You all know it, right? Marriage choice used to be limited to someone local. Now with dating apps, the world of choice is paralyzing. It includes brides from Vietnam, for example. I met someone on a plane about 10 years ago who, an Aussie fellow, and is a man not dissimilar to my age. He was heading out to meet his Thai bride that he was meeting. Needless to say, she was 20 years his junior. More choice, more happy. The research says we are far less happy today than 60 years ago, and anxiety is skyrocketing. If I was to, I'm not going to do it, if I was to do a poll in this room, if you know someone or are someone who suffers from anxiety, I reckon literally every hand in the room would go up. Sociologist Arnold Gallen said this: overwhelmed with choice we are, and so we want to reduce options in our lives, a simpler life. People opt for less freedom. And at this point, fundamentalism comes into the frame of people's thinking, whether right, left, faith-based, wrong, right. We seek simple answers, or those who give simple answers with certainty. They become the lifeboat from this way of being, this anxiety. So here's what I said. Freedom from danger became freedom of choice. Choice multiplied, and that has caused in our day anxiety, unhappiness, discontent. And so what is the response to that? Typically the response is to grasp for the certain, to grasp for the simple and the clear, to give up our freedoms to choose, to abnegate, there's a good word, look it up, abnegate your power to give somebody else your power. It occurs in politics. It can occur in religion, in ethics and morals, in social life. Now, we have to opt for something, and often the most charismatic or loudest or the best soundbite wins. And if that option is there, we go for limits to our freedom. We just want some certainty. Just tell me what the truth is. And it can happen in church. And so what's the yeast I'm talking about here? The idea that we can live without complexity. I think the phrase is we can't go back to a simpler era. Fundamentalism is all about simple certainty. The authority figure who says, don't worry about the menu, I will choose for you. We'll order for you. Outsource your decision making to us. The church leader, the online guru, the political leader, we the Pharisees or the rulers will decide for you. And so David French, the researcher, describes fundamentalism as certainty, solidarity, and ferocity. Solidarity, a tight group who share your certainty, staying away from others not like us. That was the Pharisees. Ferocity, you fight tooth and nail anyone who challenges the status quo. That was Jesus. Violence, anger, validated by the community. Certainty, solidarity, ferocity. This is the Pharisees. And you say, well, didn't Jesus do the same? No, his certainty was more rooted in his person than in an abstracted set of doctrines. He was a person of grace. He lived the life. He modeled it as being the truth. The church is described in terms of solidarity, but as inclusive of different people and people on a journey. The servant of all. And the ferocity was to be replaced, we know this happened in the first centuries of the church, with gentleness and curiosity and deep hearing and welcome. Here is bread. Come and here's bread. Here's wine. Come and join us. And in a world of binary thinking that never was praying about today, in either or certainties, it's difficult to navigate these waters because we are in complex times. So maybe a line would be something like this: I'm not sure, I don't have all the answers. I'm saying that. I will do my best to find good advice from real experts, but I will not feel driven towards a neat solution all the time. Some of life, therefore, will always be a compromise between some ideal and reality. There are some things that seem pretty good to me, creeds, my own experience of the supernatural. But what's your story? Let's hear one another. And in a country of diverse viewpoints, diverse religions, alternative ways of thinking, be alert to the algorithms that shape you. And they do. If you are ever online, you are channeled in a certain direction, down a particular train of thought, down a particular echo chamber. And humility in such a world as this is key. Humility has backbone, but it has grace towards the other person's perspective. You see, the Pharisees were certain in their certainty. We have to recognize and accept what we don't know, and with what we think we know, hold that very gently, with empathy. So Skye Jethani said this, that humility comes from rooting our security in God's unwavering love rather than in having the right answers on every issue. And that's quite hard to do. It'll tear you in two at times. You want to have neat answers. But we enter, better still that we enter in love into the journey with others and say, I'm with you in the messiness of this. Not ferocity, because people are neighbors to be loved, not enemies to be defeated. And if we don't imbibe this lesson, we run the risk as a democracy in Australia, in my view. Humility, gentleness, grace, empathy, listening, recognizing that life is always compromised a little bit. Seeing as we've already had some Monty Python, I thought we'd have some more. How to determine if it's heresy. Do you suspect heresy? Yes, well, it probably is heresy. Do you suspect heresy? No. Then you're obviously not a very good inquisitor. Finally, someone gets it. Skye Jethani again. Despite what conservative fundamentalism claims, we can't go back in time to a simpler era with less diversity and fewer decisions. And despite what progressive fundamentalism says, we can't just get rid of all the people deemed to be, quote, on the wrong side of history. Diversity and choices are part of modern life. What's the point in all this? Yeast can be both good and bad. In bread, it's great, but as an infection, not so good, right? As an idea or a way of thinking, it can sound quite good. I mean, who doesn't want freedom? Who doesn't want certainty? But it atrophies. We have to hear Jesus' words. Watch out for the yeast. Be discerning. We do have anchor points, the revelation of God in Jesus. Hold firmly and strongly to him. But there is much that can get tagged on to that. Just as the Pharisees tagged on to the law all their oral traditions. The law wasn't bad. Even their traditions weren't that bad as a means to avoid failing and sinning and doing bad things. But it became bad quickly. It ossified. It gathered barnacles. And what can I say? Life is messy. Walk in humility, holding to Jesus, the resurrected one. We are to be alert, to watch out. But not for heresy, but for atrophy. For the distortion of the good. Because we lose sight of love and justice. That's the context of this passage. It's not about Jesus saying, watch out for the heresies that are the Pharisees. It's actually for their distortions of the good. And it's for their failing to lose sight of love, causing them to lose sight of love and justice, it says in the previous chapter. So one suggestion, just as we close, just ask these questions. What are the influences that shape me, that shape us? You might want to ask these questions in a home group. Make a list. What are things that shape me? Really think about it. Reflect on it. Talk about each of them and how it works if you're in a small group or a prayer partner. How do we navigate the polarization in our world that is reinforced by the online algorithms and increases anxiety in our day? The pressures of work and home life. How do we embrace difference with grace and openness? Pray them through. Reflect on them. We have a hope that is steadfast and certain, as there's an old song that's gone through the curtain. But we also are engaging with a world that's not yet the new creation. And we're engaging with our own lives that's not yet the new creation. And therefore walk gently, walk humbly before God, love others, live in empathy with their journey and curiosity about what God's doing in their life too. Let's pray. There are so many things that influence us, Lord, and that shape us, and sometimes it's hard to see what's influencing us because we are indeed like fish swimming in a sea and trying to describe what water is rather than dryness. Lord, help us to begin to perceive with the wisdom and discernment of your Spirit the days we live in and those things that cause us to fail to love and to act justly and to love mercy. Those things that shape the way we think and the way we live our embodied lives. We would want to be disciples of Jesus, the true one. We want to have the mind of Christ. We would want to be those who are alert to the devil's subtle strategies in every which way. But simply in the midst of all that, discerning. Make us a people who love, a people who hear the journeys of everyone we meet in the coming week, a people who are gentle and kind and able to listen to those nearest to us and those who are neighbors or work colleagues or whatever. Grant us the grace to be a little bit more like Jesus this week for his glory. Amen.